In the spring of 2009, a man named Dale Hutchins stood at his fence line in Merrill County and watched a flatbed truck back up to the ditch and tip a load of pale, ragged cloth into the weeds along his property. The driver did not look at him. The mill foreman who had sent the truck, a careful and intelligent man named Went, had decided years before that the scraps were trash, and a system that measures only what is easy to count had agreed with him. For 11 years that truck came, and for 11 years Dale said nothing and carried the cloth away by the armload. By the autumn of 2020, a buyer from a design house 3 states over would write a single figure on a purchase order and slide it across a kitchen table, and Dale would read it twice before he believed it. This is the story of the years between those two moments, and of two kinds of knowing that collided along one fence in one county, and which of them turned out to be right. Let me tell you about Dale first, because the number at the end means nothing without the man at the start. He was 61 that spring, lean and slow to speak with hands that had worked the same 40 acres for most of his life. He was known in Merrill County for 2 things. The first was that he never raised his voice. The second was that he could take a thing apart, anything, a baler, a loom, a dead man's promise, and understand how it had been put together. He had grown flax once, years back, on the low ground by the creek where the soil held water, and he had a memory in his fingers of what good linen fiber felt like before it was anything at all. That memory is where this whole story begins. The mill sat 4 miles up the road, a long brick building that had spun and woven cloth in Merrill County since before Dale was born. By 2009, it ran fast and clean and made bolts of linen for a national brand whose name was printed on the sides of its trucks. Every loom in the place threw off waste. The selvage edges, the short ends, the lengths flagged by the optical scanner, for a flaw too small to see by eye. All of it went into bins, and the bins went onto the flatbed, and the flatbed went to the ditch by Dale's fence because the ditch was free. Went had run the numbers. To haul the scrap to the county landfill cost the mill money per ton. To tip it in a ditch on a back road cost nothing, and a farmer had once signed a paper saying he did not mind. That farmer had been Dale's father. The paper was still good. Went was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that early, because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and the easy version is wrong. He was a production foreman with 30 years in the mill, a man who could read a loom's health by sound, the way Dale could read a baler. He believed, sincerely and with good evidence, that a scrap was a scrap. The mill's whole logic ran on uniformity, on long, clean bolts cut to spec, and a system like that has no language for a short, irregular piece. It cannot price what it cannot stack. So the scrap had a value of 0, and Went was an honest enough man to act on what the numbers told him. The numbers told him to dump it in the ditch. The first year, Dale almost let it rot where it lay. It was just cloth, after all, pale and tangled and gone gray from the weather. Then one wet morning he picked up a length of it to clear the fence and felt the weight of it wrong in his hand. And the old memory woke up. This was not finished cloth, gone bad. Some of it was barely cloth at all. Among the woven scraps were the rejected lengths still stiff with sizing, and tangled through all of it were the tow and the noils, the short flax fibers. The mill's machines combed out and discarded because they were too short to spin into a fine, even thread. Inea, to the mill, those short fibers were the lowest grade of waste, swept from the floor under the combing line. To a man who remembered growing flax, they were something else entirely. They were linen that had never been allowed to become anything. Let me tell you about flax, because you cannot understand what Dale did without it. Flax is a tall, slender plant with a blue flower that lasts a single morning, and the fiber that becomes linen does not sit on the plant the way cotton sits on a ball, waiting to be picked. It is locked inside the woody stalk, bound to the core by a glue of pectin, and to free it, the stalk has to rot in a controlled way. This is called retting. You lay the pulled flax in a field or a slow stream, and you let bacteria and moisture eat the pectin glue without eating the fiber, and the timing is everything, because a day too long and the fiber goes weak, and a day too short and it will not separate. After retting comes breaking and scutching and combing, beating and scraping and drawing the stalks until the long fibers, the line, come away clean, and what falls to the floor are the short broken fibers, the tow and the noils. The mill bought its flax already processed in bales from overseas. It spun the long line into fine thread and swept the short tow into the bin. Dale knew, the way you know a thing in your hands and not your head, that the short fiber was not worthless. It was only short. And there are things you can make from short, strong fiber that you cannot make from long, if you are willing to do them slowly, by hand, the way nobody at a mill that runs on speed could afford to. He started carrying the cloth into the old dairy barn, sorting it under the one good window. He separated the woven scraps from the raw tow, the cotton-blended pieces from the pure flax, the pieces stiff with chemical sizing from the pieces that were clean. It took him most of that first winter just to learn what was in the ditch. His wife, Ruth, thought he had lost his sense. She would carry his coffee out to the barn and find him at the long bench with a loop to his eye, reading the weave of a scrap the way another man would read scripture, and she would set the cup down and go back to the house and not say anything, because 40 years had taught her that Dale arrived at things on his own road, and arrived late, and arrived right. There was a dog in those years, a stock dog named Tip, black and white and getting on, who had given up herding when the last of the cattle were sold and had taken up instead the full-time work of lying in the barn doorway where the sun came through. Tip was at the door the morning Dale first carried the cloth in, and Tip would be there for most of what came after. And I will tell you now that the dog matters. Not for anything the dog does, but because a story like this needs one thing in it that asks for nothing and stays anyway. By the second year, Dale had stopped thinking of the ditch as a nuisance and started thinking of it as a supply. He built a low rack along the barn wall and sorted by grade. He taught himself to wash the sizing out of the stiff lengths with nothing but rainwater and a wood ash lye his grandmother's notebook described, because there was a notebook. And let me tell you about that too, because it is the other half of where his knowing came from. Dale's grandmother, Hannah, had come to Merrill County from the old country as a young woman, and had brought with her almost nothing. But among the nothing was a cloth-bound notebook in a cramped hand, half in English and half in a language Dale could not read, full of the work she had done before there were mills to do it for her. How to ret flax in a creek. How to soften coarse tow into something fit for sacking and twine, and the rough, strong cloth a working family wears against its skin. How to spin short fiber on a distaff, how to full a woven piece, how to dye with walnut and madder and onion skin. The notebook had sat in a trunk for 50 years. Dale had looked at it as a boy and seen only a dead woman's handwriting. Now he sat with it under the lamp at the kitchen table at night and saw a manual for exactly the problem in his barn. Hannah had spent her whole life making good things out of the short, the coarse, and the discarded, because in the place she came from there was nothing else to make things out of. The mill had forgotten what she knew. Dale was about to remember it. I will ask you something here, and then I will get back to the story. Have you ever known a thing was valuable that everyone around you was throwing away? Most of us have, once or twice, and most of us let it go because the throwing away was so confident. Stay with me, because Dale did not let it go, and the not letting go is the whole point. Now back to the barn. The first thing he made was twine. It was not much to look at. He spun the coarsest tow into a rough 2-ply cord on a spinning wheel he rebuilt from parts. The wheel had been a wreck when he found it at a farm sale, the maidens cracked and the flyer gone, and he had turned new parts on a lathe in the corner of the barn over the course of a month of evenings, matching the old proportions out of Hannah's notebook because she had drawn the thing she spun on. A small, careful sketch with the measurements written beside it, in the language he could not read but could follow, like a blueprint. When the wheel finally ran true, it made a low, even hum, and Tip would lift his head at the sound and then set it back down. And Ruth said the barn at night sounded like a beehive that had learned a tune. Dale sold a few hanks of the cord to a man named Pruitt, who grew tomatoes on the edge of town and who allowed that it held a knot better than the orange plastic string from the co-op and did not cut into the vine. That was the entire enterprise for a while. A few dollars of twine, a curiosity, the kind of thing a man does in a barn that gives the whole county something gentle to shake its head about. But the making taught his hands the fiber, and slowly, the fiber taught him what it wanted to be. The cleaner tow, the stuff with more of the medium fibers in it, spun finer. Washed of its sizing and beaten soft and spun with patience, it came off the wheel as a yarn that was uneven and slubbed and nothing a mill would ever accept. And it was. Dale began to understand beautiful in exactly the way the mill's perfect thread was not. It had texture. It had the irregular living quality of a thing made by a hand that was paying attention. The mill made cloth that looked like every other bolt of cloth. Dale was starting to make cloth that looked like itself. Now, while Dale was learning the fiber in his barn, the rest of Merrill County was watching a different kind of farming. And I have to tell you about Lyle, because Lyle is the part of this story that hurts. Lyle Brenner farmed the big ground east of town, 600 acres of corn and beans. And in those same years, Lyle did everything right. Everything. The experts said he borrowed against the land and bought a new self-propelled sprayer, the color of a fire engine, and a combine with a cab like an airplane. And he signed contracts with the elevator that locked in his price and locked in his seed and locked in his chemical program. The extension meetings praised operations like Lyle's. Efficient, scaled, modern. Cool. Lyle was the future, and Dale was the past. And if you had stood in the Merrill County feed store in 2012 and asked which of those two men was building something that would last, every single person in the store would have pointed at Lyle. And they would have been wrong, and most of them were kind men who simply believed what they had been told. Lyle was not a fool, and he was not greedy. He was a good farmer carrying a debt the size of a small town, doing precisely what the credentialed world had assured him was the sound and responsible path. When his sprayer rolled across that flat black ground, it was a thing to see, and the loan officer who financed it slept easy. Because on paper, Lyle Brenner was the safest bet in the county. On paper. Remember that the value Dale was building did not appear on any paper at all. It was in a barn, in his hands, in a dead woman's notebook, in a ditch full of cloth. A mill had priced at zero. The dismissal came in the open, the way these things do at the mill itself. In the autumn of 2013, Dale drove up to the mill to ask Went a simple question. He had run out of the cleaner tow and wanted to know whether he might come and take the short fiber straight from the bin under the combing line before the weather got at it in the ditch. He stood in the foreman's office with his cap in his hands and asked plainly. Went was not unkind. He listened, and he almost smiled. And he said what a man in his position would say. He said the comber waste was the bottom of the barrel, the part of the flax that was good for nothing, and that if Dale wanted to haul it away, that was a favor to the mill. But he ought to understand he was carrying off the garbage. He called it a hobby. He said it gently, the way you would to an older man you did not want to embarrass. A hobby, he said, was a fine thing for a man with time. Dale put his cap back on. He said one thing before he left. He said, "The mill throws away the part it cannot use. That does not make it the part that has no use." Then he drove home and went back to work, and Went watched him go and felt. The records of his own conscience would later show a small, flat certainty that the old man was wasting his evenings. A hobby. The word followed Dale for years. It is a soft word, and it cuts deeper than a hard one. Because you cannot argue with it, it does not call you wrong. It calls you small. And the worst of it was that for a long time the word looked accurate, because Dale had a barn full of cloth and a wheel and a notebook, and almost nothing to show for it but a little twine and a great deal of his own time. Then his granddaughter came home, and the story turned. Maren was 24 that year, Dale's daughter's girl, and she had just finished a degree in textile and apparel studies at the State University. And she came back to Merrill County in the summer of 2014 for what she thought would be a season and stayed for the rest of the story. She loved her grandfather, and she was embarrassed by him in equal measure, the way the educated young are embarrassed by the people who raised them. She had been taught supply chains and fiber science and the economics of apparel, and what she saw when she walked into Dale's barn was a sweet old man drowning in a problem he did not have the tools to understand. She said so, more or less. She told him kindly that there was a reason the industry did not use comber tow for fine goods. The staple length was too short. The yarn would never be strong enough or even enough to compete. She had the numbers. She had been graded on the numbers. She stood in the barn doorway, stepping over the old dog, and explained to her grandfather why the thing he had spent 5 years on could not work. Dale listened to all of it. Then he handed her a skein of the slubbed gray yarn he had spun that winter and asked her to break it. She wrapped it around her hands and pulled, the way you would snap a thread, and it did not break. She pulled harder, and it held. She looked at it, this short staple yarn, that by everything she had been taught should have come apart in her hands, and she could not immediately say why it had not. That was the first crack. Not in the yarn. Let me tell you what she had not been taught, and what Dale knew without the words. For flax fiber is strong out of all proportion to its length, because of how the individual fibers bind. When you spin it with enough twist and you full it, work it wet until the fibers felt and grip each other. Short staple linen develops a tensile strength that the textbook curves, drawn from cotton and from machine spinning, do not predict. The industry did not use comber tow for fine goods, because the industry spun by machine at speed, and at speed short, fiber fails. By hand, slowly, with the right twist and the right wet finishing. The same fiber behaves like a different material. Maren had been taught the truth about machines. She had mistaken it for the truth about fiber. There is a difference, and the difference was standing in front of her holding a skein she could not break. She stayed the summer, She started asking questions, and the questions changed shape over the weeks. From "Why are you doing this?" to "How does this work?" to "What if we—" By August, she had stopped stepping over the dog and started stepping around the loom because Dale had built a loom, a wide barn frame thing, assembled from the bones of an old one and the diagrams in Hannah's notebook, and he was weaving the gray yarn into a cloth. The first piece off, it was uneven and gloriously alive, a linen with a texture like nothing on a store shelf, soft where it had been fulled and crisp where it had not. And Marin ran her hand across it and felt the entire weight of her education shift 1 degree on its axis. I will not pretend the turn was instant. She fought it. She spent a whole evening at the kitchen table, trying to model the economics and proving on paper that it could not pay, that the labor hours per yard were impossible, that no one would pay what the labor was worth. And Dale let her finish. And then he said the thing that reorganized her thinking. He said, "You are pricing it like the mill prices it by the yard. Ask instead what 1 yard is worth to the one person in 1,000 who has never been able to buy a thing like it at any price." Marin went quiet. She had been taught to compete inside the market. Dale was proposing to step outside of it, withdraw from the system that priced her grandfather at 0, and build a small one where what he made was priced correctly. It was the most radical thing she had heard in 4 years of school, and it had come from a man who had never finished high school, and she did not sleep that night. By 2016, the two of them had a real thing, small and strange and growing. They called it Nothing Fancy. The brand, when it finally had a name, took the name of the creek where the flax had once grown, and the label was a plain woven tag with no words a buyer could read. At a distance, only a single line of blue thread, the blue of the flax flower. They made table linen and bolts of upholstery, weight cloth, and a heavy slubbed yardage that interior people began to whisper about. Marin built the side of it she was made for, the photographs, the story, the careful, slow reaching out to the people who valued the made by hand over the made by machine. Dale built the cloth. And the ditch by the fence, still filled every few weeks with the mill's discarded tow, and now 2 people carried it into the barn instead of 1, and the dog still lay in the door. Here is a thing worth saying plainly, because I want you to feel the shape of it. The same truck, driven by the same drivers, sent by the same foreman, kept delivering to Dale's fence the exact material the mill had decided was worthless, all the way through the years when Dale was turning it into something the mill could never have made. To Went, it was a disposal cost solved. To Dale, it was a supply line he did not have to pay for. The mill was paying nothing to get rid of the most valuable thing it produced. And it did not know, because the mill measured cloth by the boat, and could not see a thing that was only valuable 1 yard at a time, in the hands of someone who cared. Now let me tell you what happened to Lyle, because the years that built Dale slowly were the years that broke Lyle all at once, and the 2 things happened along the same roads under the same sky. The trouble started in the markets and the weather both. In 2018, the price of corn fell below the cost of growing it, and stayed there. Lyle had locked his price the year before at a number that had looked safe, but his costs had risen underneath the lock, the chemical, and the seed, and the interest on the sprayer and the combine and the ground itself. He was running the most efficient operation in the county, and the efficiency had no slack in it anywhere. That is the thing about a system built for speed and scale. It is magnificent until the moment it is not, and then it has nothing to fall back on because every ounce of margin has been engineered out of it in the name of being lean. Then the summer of 2019 came in, hot and dry, a drought that cracked the flat, black ground Lyle farmed into a tile of broken earth, and his uniform fields, every acre the same hybrid planted on the same day, failed all at once and all the same way, because uniformity, that is a strength in a good year, is a single point of failure in a bad one. Lyle did everything a good man could do. He cut what costs he could, which was almost none because the contracts were signed and the debt was fixed. He sold the second pickup, and the boat and the calves he had been raising for his grandkids to show, and it moved the needle hardly at all against a number that size. He went to the bank, and the loan officer, who had slept so easy, now could not meet his eye, and slid a sheet of paper across the desk the way a man does when he has decided the kindest thing is to be quick. By the autumn of 2019, there was a notice on the Brenner place. At the sale the next spring, the fire engine sprayer that had been the pride of the county went for a third of what was still owed on it, knocked down to a buyer from 2 counties over in under a minute, and the combine with the airplane cab went the same way. And Lyle stood at the back of his own auction with his hands in his pockets and his cap pulled low, and watched the machines he had not finished paying for roll up onto other men's trailers and drive away down the county road. Neighbors came and stood with him and did not know what to say. So they said it was a shame, and it was, and saying so changed nothing. I want to be careful here. This is not a story where the careful farmer deserved his ruin. He did not. He followed the best advice the credentialed world had, and the advice was sound for the world the experts could measure and fatal for the world that actually arrived. The drought did not punish Lyle for a sin. It revealed a fragility that had been built into the very thing everyone had praised. That is the cruelest part, and the truest, and I will not pretend otherwise. And here is the contrast the same drought drew without a word. The summer that broke Lyle's corn did almost nothing to Dale. His supply was scrap from a mill, indifferent to rain. His few acres of flax on the low creek ground, replanted now that there was a reason to grow it, came through the dry year better than the corn, because flax is a cool-tolerant plant, with a short season and shallow needs, and because Dale had never planted all of it the same way on the same day. His income did not ride on a single commodity at a single locked price. It rode on a slow stream of finished cloth, sold to people who did not care what the weather did. While the county's biggest and most modern operation came apart in a single season, the county's smallest and most backward one did not so much as flinch. Nobody noticed at the time. They were all watching the auction. Maren noticed. She stood in the barn, that drought summer running cloth through the loom, while 4 miles east the ground cracked, and she understood at last all the way down what her grandfather had built and what she had nearly talked him out of. She had come home to save him from a foolish hobby. She stayed to learn that the foolish hobby was the only thing in Merrill County that had been built to survive a bad year. She never said the words, "I was wrong." She did something better. She gave up the apartment she had kept in the city as a way out, and she signed her name next to his on the brand, and she went looking for the one buyer who could turn what they had made into what they were owed. That buyer's name was Cora Okafor, and she came to the kitchen table in the autumn of 2020. Let me tell you who she was, because the verdict has no weight unless you know the one who delivered it. Tauber. Cora was a senior materials buyer for a design house that furnished the kind of rooms most people only see in magazines, and she had spent 20 years putting her hands on the finest cloth made anywhere in the world. She had handled linen from Belgium and Italy that cost more per yard than Lyle's corn brought per bushel. She knew fiber the way Dale knew it, with her hands, except she had touched the very best of everything, and Dale had touched, mostly, his own work. Marin had sent her a single yard folded plain in brown paper, no story, no pitch, because Dale had said, "Let the cloth talk," and the cloth had. Cora had driven 6 hours to sit at a farm kitchen table because of 1 yard of gray slubbed linen woven from a mill's garbage. She did not make small talk. She asked to see the cloth, all of it, and Ruth cleared the table, and Dale laid out the bolts, and Cora went down the length of them slowly, the way Dale went down a length of scrap, reading with her fingers. She held a piece to the window light and looked through it at the weave. She asked one question, and it was the question of someone who already knew the answer and needed to hear the man say it. She asked, "Where does the fiber come from?" And Dale told her the truth, the whole plain truth, the ditch and the mill, and the 11 years and the comber, tow the mill called garbage. Cora listened to all of it without a flicker. Then she was quiet for a long moment, and the only sound in the kitchen was the old dog breathing in the doorway, and she took out a pad and wrote a figure and turned it around on the table so Dale could read it. It was an order for the first year. One number, $40,000. Dale read it twice. He had spent 11 years carrying cloth out of a ditch, and the most he had ever made in a year of it was a few $1,000s of twine and yardage. And here was a senior buyer from a house he had never heard of offering him $40,000 for the first year of a standing order, with a price per yard written underneath that was more than the mill got for its finest bolt. He did not say anything for a while. He was not a man who said things. He set the pad down and he looked at it, and Ruth put her hand on his shoulder, and Marin turned away to the window because she did not want anyone to see her face. It landed harder than a number like that should, because of everything stacked behind it. $40,000 was not a fortune. Lyle had owed 20 times that. But it was the whole weight of 11 years, arriving at once the verdict of the one person in the world most qualified to render it, and it said in plain arithmetic what Dale had known in his hands since the second wet morning at the fence. The mill had been wrong. The county had been wrong. Marin in the beginning had been wrong. The scrap was not garbage. It never had been. It had only been waiting for someone patient enough to be right about it, slowly. Cora did one more thing before she left, and it was the thing that turned a sale into a future. She said she did not want him to scale it. She said it level and certain, senior buyer, telling a farmer the opposite of what every other voice would tell him. She said the value was in the hand, and the slowness and the strangeness, and that the moment he bought a machine to make more of it faster, he would be making the mill's cloth again, and she would have no use for it. "Keep it small," she said. "Keep it. Exactly. This strange. Make as much as your hands can make, and no more. And I will take all of it, and so will 3 other houses I can name, and you will never have to grow this thing past what you can carry out of that barn yourself." Dale, who had never wanted to grow it past that anyway, nodded once. It was the only business advice he had ever been given that matched what he already believed. Word found its way back to the mill, the way word does in a small county. It was Marin who told Went, not out of triumph, but because she needed something. And what she needed is the part of this story I am proudest to tell. She drove up to the mill in the winter of 2021 and asked to see the foreman, and Went came out expecting a complaint. Instead, this young woman asked him whether the mill might sort its puberto by grade before it went in the truck, and whether she might pay for the cleaner stream. She offered him money for the garbage. Wen stood in the cold doorway and did a thing that is harder than people give it credit for. He updated. He did not bluster, and he did not pretend he had known all along. He asked her plainly what they were making from it, and she told him, and he asked if he could come and see. And a week later, the foreman, who had called it a hobby, stood in Dale's barn with his cap in his hands, the exact posture Dale had stood in 8 years before in his. And he watched the loom throw the shuttle, and he put his hand on a bolt of cloth made from the thing he had spent his career throwing away, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I called it garbage." Dale said, "You had no reason to think otherwise. The mill never taught you what it forgot." And the two men, who had each been right about the half of the world they could see, stood in the barn and looked at the cloth together. They did not become partners in anything grand. But the mill began to sort its tow, and Dale began to pay a fair small price for the cleaner grade, and the ditch by the fence stopped filling because there was no longer any reason to throw away a thing that someone 4 miles down the road would buy. Went sent his best comber operator, a young man with a good eye, to spend a few Saturdays learning from Dale how to tell the grades apart by feel, and that young man took the knowing back into the mill, and a little of what Hannah had carried across an ocean in a cloth-bound notebook seeped quietly back into the place that had forgotten it. Knowledge has a way of finding its way home if even one person refuses to let it die. Marin runs the brand now. Dale still weaves, slower than he did, and he has taught her the loom and the fulling and the reading of the fiber. And he has given her the notebook, Hannah's notebook, which sits now in a glass-fronted case in the barn, where the light from the good window falls on it. They sell to 4 houses and a handful of people who find them by word of mouth, and they make exactly as much cloth as 2 pairs of hands can make, and not 1 yard more, and the price per yard has only gone up. Marin teaches now, too. Twice a year, young people come to the barn and learn to spin short fiber the way the industry says cannot be done, and they leave knowing it can, and some of them go home and do it. And the thing Hannah knew spreads a little wider each year. It is a small business by any measure a bank would use. By the measure that counts, it is one of the richest things in Merrill County. Lyle works for the county now, on the road crew, and there is no shame in it, and Dale hires him in the autumn to help with the flax harvest, the few acres on the creek ground. Because Lyle is a good hand and a careful man, and the two of them have an understanding that does not need many words. Lyle ran the numbers the experts gave him, and the numbers were honest about a world that did not arrive. Dale ran the numbers in a dead woman's notebook, and they were honest about the world that did. Neither man was a fool. One of them was simply listening to a wiser and a slower kind of arithmetic, and the difference between them was not intelligence and was not virtue. It was only which kind of knowing each one trusted when the confident voices were loudest. Let me tell you the thing this story has been circling all along, and then I will let it go. There are 2 kinds of knowledge in this world, and they do not weigh the same in every season. There is the wide kind, the kind that can measure 1,000 acres and price 1,000,000 bolts and model a market, the kind that is confident and credentialed and almost always useful, and occasionally at the time horizon that matters most, catastrophically blind. And there is the narrow kind, the kind that knows one piece of ground or one fiber or one trade all the way to the bottom, the kind that cannot scale and cannot explain itself on paper and is dismissed as a hobby by people who measure only what stacks. The wide kind built Lyle's beautiful, fragile farm. The narrow kind built Dale's small, unbreakable one. A system will always tell you the thing it cannot measure is worth nothing. A system is not lying when it says that. It simply cannot see. What is rigid breaks in the bad year, and what is supple holds, and the most valuable thing a place produces is very often the thing it has decided to throw in a ditch. The truck does not come to the fence anymore. The ditch is grown over with grass and the blue flax flowers that seed down from the creek field each spring, blooming for a single morning and gone by noon. The old dog is buried under the good window where the sun comes through, and a younger one lies in the doorway now, and the loom still throws its shuttle in the barn where a woman, who came home to rescue her grandfather, stayed instead to inherit what he knew. On the bench by the window sits a basket of gray, toe-combed and waiting, the part of the flax the world calls worthless, ready in the morning to become the only thing of its kind. Dale was right about it for 11 years before anyone agreed. Some things are worth knowing alone until they are not.